I'm going to be answering top 10 questions on personal finance. Number 1. How much should I have in an emergency fund? So, emergency fund is something you should have. Before you start investing, I think the first step is to build your emergency fund. So, like the name suggests, emergency fund is money that you are saving for emergencies. And the guideline is normally around 3 months of your expenses. If you have a family and you live in a country where it's quite hard to find a job, and if you like to be on the safer side, some people even save up to 6 months. So your expenses can be calculated by looking at your bank statements and adding up all your expenses. If there were some one-off expenses like traveling, holidays, you don't have to factor that in. But this is the monthly expenses that you need to live. Rent, electricity, groceries, transport, council tax, stuff like that. And then you times it by 3, and that should be the minimum emergency fund. And emergency funds, I would put it in as a bank account where you can access straight away. If you can find something that gives you some interest, like 1.5% up to 3%, which is great. So you put that aside. And then you leave that in case an emergency pops up. It could be your house is broken, your house can be broken, or it could be the boiler, or your car had an accident, and you use this emergency fund to deal with the emergency. And this just gives you a peace of mind. And the reason why I suggest you do this before you start investing is once you invest, the long-term goal is to just leave it there so the money will grow over time through compound interesting. And you don't want to be pulling money out. That's not the point of investing. Investing is to put your money in, and then especially if you're young-ish, so 20s, 30s, and even 40s, I think you need to look at in the long run, leaving your money in for 25 years plus. And it's for those days when we won't be able to work anymore and we need the pensions, we need the money to fund our life. So yes, emergency fund, 3 to 6 months. Second question, how do I get out of debt faster? Getting out of debt is an equation game. So you need money to repay the debt, and to have money, you need to have income that's more than expenses. So if there are ways that you can get a second job or a part-time job to increase the income, that will be the best. Or you might have to look for a new job that does pay you more. And through experience and through research, it is true that your pay rises more when you go to a different company than staying in one company, which may only give you inflation, which may only give you 1 to 3% pay rise. Whereas when you're jumping to a different company, I think normally most people do get about 10% or even higher pay rises. So one option is to increase your income. Second option is to decrease your expenses. So if you are paying off debt, it might mean that you don't eat out, you don't order deliveries, and you cook a nice meal at home. And it could be a humble meal. It could be spaghetti bolognese. It could be eggs as the protein and not having steak. But I think being intentional is the most important thing. So, if it's going to throw you off the routine by doing that and telling yourself, I need to do this for the rest of the year or for a whole year, you can say, okay, once a month, I'm going to eat something I love. It could be a nice steak. But other than that, I am going to try to stick to my budget of £50 per week and buy cheaper protein to cover and stretch your money. And when you have increased the income or decreased expenses, that's going to give you more money that you can throw at paying off debt. So some people say pay off debt with the highest interest first, which is true. But at the same time, if that balance is big and you have multiple debts, sometimes what can also work is paying off the smallest amount, because the debt with the smallest balance, because getting rid of one debt wholly will give you that mental boost of like, oh yes, I can do this, and then you end up paying off the debt as quicker than you think. So that's one of the ways to get out of debt faster. Following on question is similar to that question. Should I prioritize paying off debt or investing? So the rule of thumb, I think, is 7%. So S&P 500, which is a fund in, it's an investment fund where you're investing into the 500 companies in US. They have been returning more than 10% in past few years, but as a conservative number, people say you should expect about 7% return by investing into stock and shares in the US market. So 7%, holistic number 7 is a good number to think about. So if your debt interest is higher than 7%, yes, you should pay off that debt first before you use that money to invest. However, if your debt's interest rate is lower than 7%, then I think it makes more sense for you to use that money to invest because the returns will be greater. So a good example would be credit card debts. Some credit card debts can go up to 20-something% interest. So what this means is if you've borrowed £100 on credit card and you haven't paid back, they're going to charge you 20, say if the interest rate is 25%, you need to pay back £125 instead of the 100. So it will make more sense when you have that spare £100 to pay off the credit card than use that £100 to put it into stock and shares ISA. However, a different debt would be mortgages. So some mortgages, the interest rate could be 4%. So that means whatever your mortgage balance is, 4% you're paying interest on. However, the interest we receive, the gain we receive by investing is normally, you can expect it to be about 7%. So instead of overpaying your mortgage, some people may choose to invest into stock and shares ISA, which I think is a fair decision. Right, so that was whether you should prioritize paying off debt or investing. Next question, what is an ISA? I've already mentioned ISA. So ISA, ISA, stands for Individual Saving Account. So in the UK, which is where I'm based, ISA, you can have a cash ISA or a stock and shares ISA. And I would always recommend stock and shares ISA. So cash ISA is just like a normal bank account where you just hold cash, and some will give you some interest with like in addition. So it could be at 1.5% or 3%. So that means if you put in £100 to that bank account over a year, it will give you 1.5%. So 1.5% of £100 is £1.50. So if you leave that £100 in that bank account for 1 year, your £100 will become £101.50. So the second category of ISA, individual savings account, is stock and shares. Stock and shares ISA is where you're putting your money into stock and shares. And what does stock and shares mean? Stock and shares is owning a slice of listed companies. So listed companies are companies that's gone public and said, you can fund us and then I will give you back a bit of our return. And you own a little bit of that company. So putting your money into stock and shares, you can either choose individual companies. You can say, okay, I want to own Apple, I want to own Samsung, or you can say, I want to put my money into a fund or an ETF. Fund is like, think of it as a group. So instead of owning just Apple, If you invest your money into S&P 500, you own top 500 companies in the US. So that is what stock and share ISA is. And ISAs are very good because it's tax free. So every year there's a amount. So right now is £20,000 for stock ISAs, where up to £20,000 you are not going to get taxed on the gain. So if you've put in £100 and then it's gone up 7%, it becomes £107. And normally, if you haven't used ISA accounts, in that £7 gain, you have to pay tax. And depending on how much you're earning, this could be from 15% to 45%. So part of it you need to give to the government. But because government wants you to encourage you to invest and save, ISAs are tax-free. We will continue with the questions.